Welcome, bienvenidos. On behalf of the Latin American Program and the U.S. Institute of Peace, it's a pleasure to welcome you to our event, Mobilizing Latin American Citizens Against Corruption, Lessons for Guatemala on Restorative Justice, Collective Action, and Citizen Participation. I just want to mention quick, the United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress in 1984 and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical and essential for U.S. and global security. The Institute works with local partners to prevent, mitigate, and resolve violent conflict. The objective of our event, Mobilizing Latin American Citizens Against Corruption, is to bring international experts, like the ones we have gathered here in this panel today, together with officials of the Guatemalan National Commission for Corruption that we have here in the audience, and their advisory delegates, or consejeros delegados, for a combination of roundtables and workshops to discuss new approaches to countering corruption, including collective business action, restorative justice, and citizen participation, which is the topic of this panel. This session will explore how to build broad civic networks to promote transparent, accountable, inclusive, and participatory governance. As we know, corruption is corrosive. It damages trust in public officials and undermines the institutions charged with upholding the law and protecting the weak. To build a culture that values the rule of law, citizens need to understand how corruption impacts their daily lives and how they can play an active role in holding public officials accountable. My name is Lucila Del Aguila. I'm a senior program officer for the Latin America program, and I will be moderating this discussion. Let me introduce you to our panelists today. First of all, we have Cheri-Leigh Erasmus, who is the Chief Learning and Agility Officer for Accountability Lab, which is a nonprofit organization aimed at making governance work for people by supporting active citizens, responsible leaders, and accountable institutions. We have Reina, who is the director of el Instituto Distrital de la Participación y Acción Comunal from Bogotá, Colombia. Then online, unfortunately, she couldn't make it with us. It's Mariana Perales, General Director of Hagámoslo from Monterrey, Mexico. It's a Mexican NGO based in Monterrey, as I mentioned, focused on promoting actions that lead to sensitizing and committing citizens to a culture of lawfulness. And finally, one of our guests of honor here is Gabriella Castillo, Director of the Citizen Participation and Inclusion Office from the National Commission Against Corruption in Guatemala. Just a few reminders. This panel will be bilingual, so we'll start in English with Cheri-Leigh, and then we'll move on to Spanish with Alexander, Mariana, and Gabriella. We do have Spanish, English, Spanish translation. Each panelist will have between 8 to 10 minutes at the most for their presentation. And at the end, I hope after 25 minutes, we will open the floor for a Q&A session. Those who are watching us through our webcast, you do have the option of asking questions. So we'll start with Cheri-Leigh. Welcome. We know that Accountability Lab focuses on making governance work for people by supporting active citizens and responsible leaders. If you can describe how Accountability Lab builds alliances, channels ideas from the local level to the high-level decision makers on governance. And if you could give us some specific examples of your work worldwide, and I know that you also work in Latin America. So thank you, Cheri, and welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Again, my name is Cheri, and I'm from the Accountability Lab. We work predominantly across South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And our work on making governance work for people is centered on enabling communities to hold governments accountable, especially as it relates to anti-corruption. I think there are a few things that are critical when it comes to enabling that bottom-up accountability. And one of the first things that's important in our work is re-engaging people and meeting them where they are, especially when they've lost trust in their government. In the spaces where I work, we face endemic corruption. And as we know, corruption erodes trust between governments and their people. And so at Accountability Lab, a core part of our work is getting people re-engaged in governance processes, people who have often veered away from even voting or participating in participatory budgeting practices and things like that, because they just might not think that their voice even matters in those processes. So one of the ways we do this is by finding people where they are. We use many creative ways to re-engage, especially young people, indigenous communities, women, and people who are often left on the outskirts of governance processes. And one of the ways that stand out in the sector is we use the arts quite often. So using music, using local languages, in a time when a lot of organizations are turning to social media and predominantly online ways of reaching communities, we found that reaching the most marginalized communities is often most helpful via low-tech methods. So in many countries where we work, we actually use community radio and in local languages, using hyper-local other CSOs as our partners to understand what the challenges are that communities are facing directly. Because to work on governance and accountability and anti-corruption issues, we need to make it relatable. One of the ways we do this is also through gathering citizen-generated data. So we train local enumerators, people we call community frontline activists, to gather not only corruption perceptions, but also the service delivery challenges tied in with corruption in communities. And this data is then used to gather the community with private sector actors, with civil servants and local elected officials, to ultimately co-create solutions to those challenges. We found that being able to say that 89% of the community do not think they have clean drinking water gets us way further in getting people around a negotiating table or actively working towards solutions together than just making broad statements like water is an issue. So this is why we've invested so much in quality citizen-generated data. This data is used at the local level, as I mentioned, to try and influence budgets, to co-create those solutions, but also fed up into national level policy-making processes. So some examples would be from, for example, in Nigeria, where we've been doing this for a very long time, we've been able to better understand why people with disabilities do not participate in governance processes and how they are then affected by this adversely. And we've been able to change practices and policies so that processes are more accessible to people with disabilities. In other countries, such as like Mexico, we've been working on influencing budgets around things like water and sanitation and other direct service delivery issues that influence communities, bringing corruption down to their level. With this, we try to rebuild trust for people that there can be change because they're directly involved in finding the solutions and pushing for that change. Secondly, we incubate new ideas. So across the countries where we work, we identify what we call accountapreneurs. These are accountability entrepreneurs, people who are coming up with creative ways to increase accountability in their systems. We've worked with people who are creating more access to justice, for example. In Mexico, we have an accountapreneur who's using music to advocate around stronger access to justice for women who are incarcerated, and other anti-corruption issues as well. We try to build this ecosystem of young, fresh ideas by not only growing people's projects and helping them scale, but building the organizational capacity and foundation so that these ideas that people are working on become fundable and become sustainable. And this is the way in which we're trying to build the civil society ecosystem in these countries where we work, and also connecting them to each other. So it's from going to building trust to building the networks of people working together, because ultimately in the anti-corruption pipeline, we're all working on different things. We're often working with people working on private sector advocacy, others working on access to justice, and others working on making governance more transparent. But all of these issues need to be tackled, and if we can incubate these ideas and build these networks of civil society actors, we found that the outcomes over time are greater. A last thing I'd want to mention is that this incubation that we're doing has also led to the use of emerging technology in the fight against corruption. We found that there are many young people in the countries where we work and beyond that have technology skills and have an interest in getting engaged in anti-corruption work, but aren't necessarily part of civil society movements or organizations working directly on corruption issues. So we started a program called Corruption, which we've also implemented across 6 countries in Latin America. And this is geared towards building multi-stakeholder cohorts of people in academia, technologists, civil society actors, and journalists who work together to come up with new ideas using technology to make governance more transparent. A tangible example of that could be some platforms that we've built that in real time visualize the procurement system of countries so that ordinary citizens find the data around things like procurement and tender processes way more transparent, or using artificial intelligence to scrape documents that are ultimately not as accessible to ordinary citizens into visualizations that again get people in civil society organizations that do not necessarily work at the high-tech level engaged and able to monitor government processes more successfully. This also provides journalists and citizen journalists with the data they need to ultimately hold government accountable. Ultimately, the 3 things that I would say has been the founding principles of our work has been fostering trust, building these networks, and meeting people where they are. So we always work in partnerships. While we do have offices and our own staff in the countries where we work, we think that for especially localization efforts in anti-corruption to work, we need to work with organizations at the hyper-local level where communities are most affected to amplify those voices and to also share capacity there so that what we learn on the ground can be fed up into national policy-making processes and ultimately get people who have lost trust in the system re-engaged in anti-corruption actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheri. I think it was extremely insightful what you just mentioned because it follows well with what Alexander, who will talk next, will talk about in a little bit more deeper explanation. Alexander will talk about his experience as the director of the Instituto Distrital de la Participación y Acción Comunal in Bogotá. And as Cheri mentioned, one of those ways of building trust is through participatory budgets. So, Alexander, si nos puedes decir, changing to Spanish, I'm sorry, si nos puedes...
If you can give us an example of how the township, for example, in Bogotá, has allowed this participation of citizens that Cheri was just mentioning, for example, in participatory budgets. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for this invitation. It's lovely to be here, especially in a panel with just women, and to be the only man here. Thank you to the Institute. I really appreciate this invitation. In terms of the participatory budget, it's very interrelated to our policies in the mayorship of Bogotá. The main purpose in the campaign for anti-corruption is to think about innovation, participation, and engagement. Next, please. Now, in regards to decision-making, we have had to face a huge challenge. I want to share lots of ideas here in these next couple 10 minutes, but I'll try to keep it brief. Thank you very much. Perfect. All right. Now, this experience of the participatory budget in a city with 7 million people, how can that really make a change? We don't want it to just be a simulation or a catharsis, which is most of the experience we've seen in Latin America. We realized that, well, something that helps here in this participatory budget is for there to be clear rules. Meaning, in Bogotá, it's not only of wanting to change something, but that there's rules for something to be established more firmly. We were able to make sure that the mayor dispersed 50% of the resources to the different localities, about $69 million that we dispersed to the different sectors. And now that I heard about the concepts of development, it's really planning the development and the resources. That's what we believe helps. It's planning in those different scenarios. And that helps us connect to that actual action making, or that action, putting everything into action. So we had the budget, but we didn't have that participation from civil society or the public to see where that money would go. And we realized that those decisions, just like in the rest of the world, it's not that the people create a shopping list. First, they vote on the concept of expense. Let's say, okay, this X amount of $1 million, what would you spend it on? That was my second point. And thirdly is the exercise of just using that participatory budget, including innovation, for example. So we mix a lot of different concepts. And we would talk, we spoke earlier about cultural issues, etc. And so we hold assemblies and hold meetings in auditoriums. And during these hundreds of meetings that we held, gave space to the people to also participate. The participatory budget made a promise to people in Bogotá, meaning that they would be able, the people, to also decide where this was going to go. We were able to establish roles and places where people could participate in the design, the internal control, and the execution of that budget. Now, this is a very recent effort that we've been making. We've only been doing this for about 4 years. And by doing so, we've wanted to include all sorts of people here. Our Afro community, indigenous communities, and all others. Really inviting everybody. And to mark those differences by land, as well as that digital gap specifically. Because if we think just about technology, even in the capital city, there are gaps between people of 40 to 45% in terms of access to the internet. And I'd like to highlight the following. The biggest change is giving power to citizenship, to the people. They then are able to make decisions and really participate. That's the biggest difference. Since this is simulated and this is a catharsis, then there's a lot of effort that the governor has to make, because then they're able to change things in terms of anti-corruption, but they don't change the people. No, the people don't change, rather. Now, the people voted on 3,942 different initiatives, which were presented to them. Now, one of the main things we can focus on here is cultural change. For the administration to tell people every resource that you'd like to be assigned in a certain place, it needs to be through participatory budget, not through a politician or a network. No, the initiative has to be presented. We have to mobilize people and have them vote. That's one of the paths. It's not the only path, but it is one of the paths that we have available. And this can really lead to changes because that's when people started realizing that's how they can access the resources. They didn't have to tell me directly or the mayor, hey, let's fix this road, or they didn't have to approach the politicians. No, they can do it through the participatory budget. We started with 37,000 voters, and we went up to 317,000 of 7 million people in the city. And from there, from that point on, we can make even more changes. Now, although human capital can't change the problem, this is one path that we can take. For example, our entity created a training school with about 7,000 people with skills and in a learning process. And so we created this like this career so that they could be trained and study. Now this graph we see on the slide shows that if we change the speaker, then the results change. So we no longer started or continued asking leaders and politicians what changes they wanted to make locally, because that goes through political parties and popular vote. What we started saying is that the resource we're going to assign to you as citizens is this percentage. And then we would ask them, what are your priorities? And that's what you can see on the graph. And that's when we would see other things. For example, cultural issues, recreation and exercise, sports, and then women. The topic of gender, for example, did not show up, but later showed up through this research. Then participation. So all of this stigma, citizen engagement, this helped so that their priorities could be on the list as well. And that line right on the bottom, that's in reference to coexisting with others, but also streets, things that are used by everyone. So previously, things would have to be taken to the politicians. So we believe that there's a change here. Things have changed, but we're still in progress. I mean, this isn't done yet. And so this is very important because we've been able to create this training process, human capital, decide with the people. But if we don't give information to the people, then this is going to be a very invasive decision-making process. We hope this will be very successful. Now every city can see what phase they're on, how everything's going. And on your left on the screen, you can see how the results are at about 100% of the phase, and the other one we're at 54 because there's been a change of government, and so this has delayed the process. One of the main challenges, and I'm almost done here, is related to the capacity that institutions have, which was an issue for us, but we were able to manage this because of the political will of the mayor in this regard. People participated, but in addition to this, we achieved this empowering of civil society. People started to participate, and we were talking earlier about everyone that's participating, and yeah, people really participated and decided on how the resources would be used, and then they would ask us to give them spaces so that they could carry out tasks and projects, carry out every single initiative that we were addressing. And so this is one of the things that we've been working on.
In addition to that, we believe that given it's a proposal that really breaks the way in which the government executes these resources, but now they have to speak to the citizenry and then change the way in which they act and call the people. This, of course, really implied a tremendous change within the institutions, and we hope that it remains for the next government, the next administration. And of course, not every story is like Alice in Wonderland and perfect. Everything we need, there's a lot of room for growth and improvement. The most important thing here is continuity throughout the administrations. The fight against corruption is a long-term fight. It's not short-term, and that is why not allowing our government to continue. If we had a completely opposite government, instead of leaving 50% of the resources for this work, they would reduce it to 10%, and they did that, and it's very worrisome. Now, what we were saying in terms of cultural transformation, that means that the change needs to be maintained in practice. So if the government or the leader keeps insisting that the governor needs to respond to the people and report to the people. We have currently a leader that is in agreement with this, so it would be difficult if it were otherwise. And of course, in Colombia, given the armed conflict, we are going through a difficult process. Nobody trusts anyone. Nobody wants to organize or take collective action. But these processes, since they insist that the citizenry define the path forward, in 4 years they could invest $35 million in citizen participation, and this is something that helps, but it's not enough. We have to start investing in civil society and reconstruct the agricultural production and invest in the economic and democratic crises that we are facing. We really need to define concrete policies that motivate collective action. Otherwise, we're going to lose the progress. Or, for example, you won't have with whom to work, so you have to invest in this, and this is a very fruitful investment for the country. And I think this is also one of the biggest challenges that we have, is the best way to fight corruption is that if you have a government that is convinced of this, is that you would make sure that what they've promised they, fulfill. I believe that this is one of the biggest challenges we have with regard to the participative budget. This city still needs to learn that these execution procedures require citizen dialogue with the people and technical knowledge, and we're still learning in this regard. But it's still hard for people to understand that they don't have the technical capacity always to get involved. So both transparently and technically, we need to encourage citizen participation. So from this experience, and of course I'm here. We've had this experience, and I would love to take your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alexander, especially regarding the explanation of the example in terms of from the government facing the citizens. And of course, we had the presentation by Cheri-Leigh. She gave us worldwide examples of what they are doing to truly achieve citizen participation in these anti-corruption efforts. And then, of course, we have the example that Alexander gave at the government level toward the citizens. And now we have Mariana Perales from Monterrey, Mexico. She's the director of Let's Do It Right. And this is an example of how you can work from the grassroots, from the citizens. And so, Mariana, please tell us a little bit about the origin of Let's Do It Right, how this in 2013, this idea was born. And please tell us about your achievements and your challenges. Thank you. Thank you, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here, collaborating with all of you and sharing with you what we've done here in Monterrey. And just as you say, I've loved listening to my colleagues because everything is kind of fitting together. And the topic that I will share with you is basically how we're working with citizens to combat corruption and to promote and strengthen the culture of legality. So first, I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about how our organization was born. It's a civil society organization that got its start in Monterrey, Mexico. And I would invite all of you to come check our city out. But here, just for a little background, Monterrey is located in the north of Mexico, and we really stand out in terms of business and leadership in different sectors, such as corporate social responsibility and so forth. But when we established Let's Do It Right, we were seeing how both in Mexico and in the city that there was a growing trend toward a lack of public safety due to organized crime. But this was clearly affecting the daily lives of all peoples, all citizens. And of course, I can say that in Monterrey, we are not accustomed, thankfully, to these levels of lack of public safety that we are currently experiencing. And now, very concerned with the situation, a group of citizens who were people, civil people, social folks who worked in the social sector and private sector came together to talk about what can we do about this? How can we collaborate to change that reality that was affecting our community? So the first thing we did before we actually established the organization was to research our own context, and we began by analyzing and carrying out social research to understand what was the perception of the people regarding this issue of corruption and violence. And then we looked into how could we coordinate in a more effective manner. And through the research we carried out, we realized that this context of violence and lack of public safety was also a place where the idea or the perception that illegality or criminality is normal, that corruption is normal. And so if we add this to the context that I mentioned to you, we're looking at a ticking time bomb. So we also realized through our research that the people felt they felt impotent, not really able or empowered to generate change in society. And so we have this sensation of, what can I do? If I'm just a teacher, if I'm a environmental NGO, or if I'm a business person, what can I do? So in this context, we have the birth of our organization as a response, a civil response to the people in the face of these problems. So we had a very clear idea. The idea is that society, people, should play a very active role in promoting a culture of legality. And so the culture of legality, and I'd like to very quickly tell you that for us what that means. Because the culture of legality is not something we see as just a blind complement to the laws and regulations, right? We see it more as a fundamental component of social norms and of coexistence, as well as citizen participation. It's not about, enforcing laws in a particular way, in a single way. So based on this idea, and this is what we tried to do since we started the initiative, to see if this context could change if we understood that what was happening could be shifted through both individual and collective behavioral shifts. and could we make these changes as a collective group? And that is how this movement was born. And we started by calling together social leaders. We had more than 50 society leaders come together, and we would provide trainings on these topics. And it didn't matter what sector they came from or in which they worked. And that's how our group came about. And then we tried to advocate through programs. Obviously, the issue of corruption and criminality or legality is multi-sectorial. So we needed to have a multi-sectorial approach. So we established programs that could advocate in different settings, in different contexts. For example, we have the program of the business program, which is how can, from a business organization, through the strengthening of certain systems, in addition to adding the business culture to the culture of legality in an explicit manner, and how can it be incorporated into the philosophy of the business, and how working in this context, and not only in that particular business, but in the business sector in general. And that's how the private sector would, that's a program we have for the private sector. Then we also have a program for the schools, which involves the creation of educational spheres, where we teach that, education, we don't only bring in the culture of legality into the curriculum, but also the practices themselves of, that the institutions, educational institutions carry out. For example, their relationship with the families and the community. For example, in this sense, we have an emblem that we give to the schools that promote the culture of legality throughout Mexico. So this has served as sort of a incentive for the organizations. It's an award, in fact, that we provide them to incentivize the educational institutions. And then we have a program for the public spaces. Of course, this is a very broad topic, a broad space, but we really wanted to focus on mobility and the roads. Now, of course, the issues that most affected the citizens that they pointed out were, the traffic issues. So how could complying with traffic laws, contribute to harmony among, and coexistence among the citizens? And the fourth group, the fourth program
is a program we call SUMA. This is a program for culture and legality. And similar to my colleagues, we created new and creative ways to engage the community with projects, open government projects, for example, with officials and other actors, so that we could have a more transversal, cross-sectional engagement. Now, how do we divide this? And just to conclude as well, I'd like to mention a couple of key points. I'd like to refer to some lessons that we've learned that have been positive within our organization. This has been key to us to be able to tackle corruption. First, citizen mobilization. That really supports them in their engagement. So not only to give it the importance that it deserves, but really reframe it to see how we can propose this when speaking to civil society, and for them to do it through their profession as well, their professions, independent of their age, and that's how we will really able to create that social change, etc. Are you able to hear me okay? I hear a bit of a feedback. Yes, please go ahead. I guess there's some interference, but I think it's okay. All right, sounds good. So the pro-positive civil engagement. So expanding the perspectives of this to make it go beyond corruption. Second, strategic alliances. So obviously we can't do all of this ourselves as an association. So we have a network with more than 400 organizations, companies, nonprofits. We work with them on an internal level. We've also tried to think out of the box a little bit and include actors that can directly speak to citizens. For example, in Monterrey and some other Latin American cities, something that's very popular are soccer games and soccer clubs and teams. And so we try to invite actors in this industry to support our message. And in fact, a lot of people have joined. And finally, apart from mobilizing them and having strategic alliances, is measuring and ranking things. So to really measure the way things have gone and progressed. From the very beginning, what we've been doing is diagnosing and calculating how well things have gone. We have one survey on legality or criminality, which we used, and this has measured perception, knowledge, and citizen engagement. We've done 5 surveys to be able to monitor how things have advanced. This has been key for us. This has allowed us to see the impact of our efforts and where our gaps are. 5 of these surveys that we've carried out have shown us what we've been able to change. The main thing that we've seen is how willing citizens are to actually put effort into this. This is what we've seen across the surveys, that citizens feel more responsible to tackle these issues. And another challenge that I have to acknowledge, and that the data has shown us, is that despite having been able to increase that co-responsibility with citizens and civil society, we continue to see some challenges with people's perception of corruption in their environment. So, for example, how to work with the government, how to maintain that enthusiasm on behalf of civil society to continue in this fight against anti-corruption, and how their mentality changes, trying to maintain that, really. So I hope I've been able to share the experience within our association. We are completely convinced that all of these efforts and all of these sectors that participate are really going to have a huge and constructive impact for a stronger, more fair city. Thank you so much, Mariana. That was a great presentation. It was very interesting, especially to know what you've been doing in Monterrey. I think that we've been able to come up with some new ideas and really understand in summary what you've done, empowering civil society and making or engaging civil society as well. Thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I think these points are going to help the Commission in Guatemala. We're going to give the floor now to Gabriella. I'm sure that you've been considering these concepts as well. Some of these concepts that our other panelists have been speaking about, I'm sure that you have considered as well and have included. So please go ahead. Hi, everyone. I'm Gabriella Castillo. I'm the Director of Citizen Participation and Inclusion. at the National Commission Against Corruption. It's a pleasure to be here. It's great to hear about these practices, experiences, and lessons learned, because of course not everything is easy on the way. And this really helps and supports our efforts as well. Our efforts have been going down the same path to be able to engage civil society, collaborative processes, as well as strategic alliances. We also have a monitoring system to see how we can improve and how well we've done up until now. So I'll be making reference to what we've been doing at the Commission and in terms of citizen participation and inclusion. This way we can exchange ideas, and I'm sure that we can both learn on both sides from our common experiences. So the point of the Commission, the objective, is to support in terms of actions, policies in the fight against corruption, specifically in the executive body in Guatemala. Now these actions and these efforts are focused on a preventative measure long term. What we really wish to do is to strengthen institutions and to engage civil society in a very constant manner. Now, we believe we have a very modern framework since we haven't done it, we haven't made these efforts before in the way that we're doing now. We have delegations made up of representatives of civil society from different sectors. We have people from civil society, academia, from the business sector, and representatives from the indigenous communities of Guatemala. The advisory delegates have a very specific function as well. In a very summarized way of saying it, they transfer to the Commission the ideas on the priorities so that we can turn them into projects and initiatives in our fight against corruption. The advisory delegates have a very clear work plan where the priorities are set. They focus on certain sectors, and we work on our projects depending on what they present. For example, how social funds and public funds are used, the work that local representatives do. We also consider how to engage civil society. The advisory delegates, they're also huge support. We're able to take advantage of the contacts and the huge network that they have. And so this way we can introduce our projects, we can get feedback, and then finally make them a reality. In this manner, we've been able to carry out dialogue as well as consultations. We try to be as representative as we can. And through our first experiences, we've been seeing and we've been learning and seeing how it goes to see how we can engage more people from civil society, from collectives, from different groups, and invite people who are interested and can identify how corruption impacts them in their daily life, and who have proposals and want to be heard and can really help be allies in these efforts. Now, during these processes, we also make sure that accountability is a big topic. Projects can be long-term and take quite a while. But our goal is really to keep everything, let's say, refresh things so that we can constantly see how it's progressing and be able to report back on the status, how the input is incorporated into the project, and so that we can finally deliver a firm and strong result. But we do make sure that the input that is given is reviewed, for everything to be collaborative. We've even made some partnerships we're trying to focus on more. For example, one of our partnerships is with a civil society organization in Guatemala, which is impulsing dialogues with young people. Now, they are going to enter into a dialogue with about 1,000 young people in Guatemala and touch upon certain topics. So, for example, anti-corruptive policies. In addition to the great work that these organizations are doing to be able to come up with this data from young people now on a national level, we're also able to enter into a dialogue with them to see how young people see corruption, how it impacts them on a daily basis, and what they already know about anti-corruption strategies in the country. And so this way, all this data is something that we can take advantage of, and we can continue developing our projects. We can base our projects on this information that we have from the civil society. We're on the 6th stage of the national plan. We have a specific strategy, which is to make sure there's access to information on behalf of the civil society. We're trying to raise awareness about not only input from the public institutions to see what the obstacles are that make it difficult for them to actually do their work, but we also want to know what information needs to still be shared so that we can join these two efforts. This is a measure that governments do to be able to understand how to carry out this work. This is one way the civil society can make sure that they participate and are part of the auditing process. This is one of the things we've been doing so that there's more access to public information. And finally, as part of our long-term goal in our fight against corruption, we're, well, at the very beginning, but we would like to institutionalize these efforts. We want this to be established and to go beyond just being a commission, for this to be something permanent with citizen engagement. And so we must be inclusive, participatory on a national level so that we can start collecting that information. What does civil society need? So this way we can create partnerships with volunteers, students, and other people so that we can collect this information, systemize them, and allow us to, at a more academic level, be able to take advantage of the expertise of civil society that have been working on this for years and years. This way we can collect the input with specific recommendations and can then be channeled into specific topics. So that's what I wanted to share, and I have a couple more things that I can share, but I think I can finish there for now.
¿Y nos podrías también comentar un poquito sobre lo que van a hacer con el Ministerio de Educación y los currículums y las tesis de los graduandos? Digo, en un minuto nada más para que también el público sepa lo que están haciendo a ese respecto con niños y jóvenes.
Sí, se están trabajando en un proyecto pedagógico informativo sobre cultura de legalidad y también en el currículum nacional base, en alianza con el Ministerio de Educación de Guatemala, se quiere implementar justamente el tratar estos temas anticorrupción. Por el momento estamos en proceso, pero es algo que se tiene ya pensado justamente para empezar ese cambio desde la juventud, la adolescencia y poder incluir.
From the youth. This is something that we want we want this to start from a young age, and that's why it's being incorporated into the national curriculum. Thank you so much. This is you've given us a lot to think about. There are a lot of concepts that are really important. We're going to continue our discussion here. We're going to open the floor to the audience for Q&A. It's going to be very brief. We don't have much time left. And I'd like to invite those that are online also to participate, as well as our guests here that are here in person. Yes, Gabrielle? And please, of course, introduce yourself. I'm Gabriel Rojas from the working at the OAS in Colombia. I thought this was a really interesting discussion, but I wanted to, especially in terms of this policy of legality. We're talking about this education initiative, which is, being used to improve, the participation of youth. Now, the culture of legality, and which can be understood as, sticking to the law for the sake of being the law. But we also know that there are unequal structures within the law. And that's where you have, the government, may come and say, hey, obey the law, but if the community doesn't believe this law is fair. And this is a problem where you have a lot of the rule of law in Latin America are not considered legitimate systems. So what do you do when the law is not considered worthwhile? And you, Gabriella, were mentioning this, that we can work both from the grassroots up and from the top down, and that how can we promote awareness that helps build trust of civil society in government. And so what is this, tell us a little bit more of this two-way work, and so that regulations can not only be legal, but also legitimate. Thank you so much. I believe this, must happen through a very collaborative process. When you're implementing these regulations, there has to be an entire process of dialogue and feedback and consultation, and then, of course, the awareness raising, and you have to continually carry out accountability exercises so you don't lose legitimacy. You can't get to the point where, now what? What's happening? What's being implemented? What are the results? What are the advances? We need to have consistent monitoring. And also how to use technology to combat corruption and how to incorporate these civil auditing type activities. At the same time, and as part of the collaborative process, you should always include the people's perspective. For example, regarding corruption, how are they affected in their daily lives, and how can we respond to the specific needs that could form part of a bit larger problem, but really need to be landed much more comprehensively. And I think we need to constantly pay attention to transparency, information access for the public, so that they can monitor the advances and the progress made on their own. Mariana, Alexander, Cheri, if you have something to add, please go right ahead.
I think that was such a good question, and apologies for not being able to answer it in Spanish. One of the approaches we found, especially when there's lack of trust in the legal system or anti-corruption laws, those can often be hard to overcome, right? There's this entrenched sense that it just isn't working, or rule of law isn't in place. And what we found has really helped us is focusing on a positive deviance approach. So not the naming and shaming approach of what isn't working, but how can we work with communities around the institutions and services that are working for them, and sort of create a ripple effect around that. So one of our programs, for example, is called Integrity Icon, and it's about identifying honest civil servants on the inside who want to work with communities and who are pushing for reforms. And we actually do storytelling around them. So they're nominated by ordinary members of the public. They go through a vetting process, and we make mini documentaries about them to showcase, hey, in the Ministry of Education, for example, there is this person pushing against the corruption tide and trying to make a difference. We're not negating that there are rule of of law issues and corruption issues, but how can we rally around these pockets of integrity where things are working? And we found and measured that this creates a narrative shift, and this positive deviance also strengthens the trust and gets people engaged.
Mariana or Alexander? Mariana?
Thank you. Yes. I completely agree with my colleagues, and this happened here in Monterrey. And we had this debate regarding the cultural of legality. In keeping with this, with what you've said about the positive impact, I also wanted to point out this concept of legality. You know, it's not a blind compliance with the law, but rather a culture of legality involves knowledge and exposure to the accusation, which is also a serious problem within our communities, is the action. And the fourth pillar of culture of legality is participation. So it's very complex, but we understand that the culture of legality, it involves all of this, and with this knowledge, we can establish programs that approach it in this way. I would add too that the culture of legality is the biggest challenge is the legal aspects. So, if we just stay at this level, it would not be enough. But of course, in countries throughout Latin America, you have to sometimes incorporate that laws must be followed. But the construction and the training of the government to be able to adapt legal structures in terms of public management based on, the community participates and it thus increased transparency and so forth. Of course, you wanted to do this at the height of the pandemic. And what was the challenge? Well, they had to adapt the law based on this dynamic so that people could participate and consider all of the different aspects. So I think there's this constant challenge. In Latin America, we have a lot of tension. On one hand, we don't believe that, correcting these, we're going to resolve the issue. So we have to have experience. We have to go through a process of hit or miss. And we need to use innovation, collaboration, to work toward toppling corruption. And it needs to be done in a way that is sustainable over time. And so this involves listening to what the people propose. And if you know that the problem doesn't go through a particular regulation, but maybe in another direction, and so you have to make that shift to be able to solve the problem. John Feely, I'd like to take your question. Thank you so much. I'm John Feely. I'm the CEO of the Center for Public Integrity for the Americas. I'm going to ask my question in English for Cheri. Not that I want to throw any shade on the Spanish speakers here, but I really want an example from outside of the region. And I've worked in all of your countries, and I believe that I recognize that corruption exists, but what I haven't been able to see is a solution to one particular issue.
In Latin America, my observation is that the biggest problem in fighting corruption is not necessarily the law. Generally, the laws are there, and nobody openly applauds corruption. But in all of the societies where your colleagues come from, there is a tacit acceptance of the corruption by elites. And you can call them captured elites. I call them complicit elites, because corrupt ministers have corrupt wives, and they have children who go to the very best schools. And in San Pedro Garza, in Monterrey, they go to the same churches as the elite. And when there are weddings and baptisms and other social events of the elite in all of these very unequal Latin American societies, the corrupt individuals are very, very rarely excluded. They are not only tolerated, they are in many cases protected, because frequently their corruption leads to jobs, it leads to patronage. So my question, given this backdrop, is, have you seen anything outside of Latin America that works to break that cycle of elite complicity with corruption?
This is a good question, and I think the complicity, at least from the different countries where I work, goes even further than elites, right? Because other people are enabling those elites, and as individuals, even non-elites, we are on a daily basis compliant with corrupt structures, whether it is getting pulled over and paying a traffic fine. As an individual, I'm still making that choice. So there's a supply and demand around corruption that I think is not just at the elite level, but certainly your example holds true. And this is why I think that corruption is actually a norms issue. Most of actually all of the countries where I work have pretty firm anti-corruption laws in place. That's not the problem. But what we need to do is shift the narrative and the norms around corruption to make corruption and those institutionalized, normalized practices not the right thing. And so the example I made with the previous question around identifying reformers and building networks and capacity and almost not idolizing, we call our work integrity icon, but making people doing the right thing the icons of the civil service, that pushes against the tide of a civil service that is inherently corrupt. And what we've seen is in different countries where we work, for example, in Pakistan, is by we've created there, we've worked with probably more than 50 icons, 5 a year, often in rural areas where it's male-dominant, entrenched sort of systems of corruption. But by highlighting women reformers, for example, we've created pathways through sort of representation for other young women to want to enter the civil service. So if you change the group of people engaged, you're able to shift a norm, because now you have a young, new, fresh, talented batch of civil servants who want to reform things. And so changing the narrative around the civil service, honoring people doing the right thing, have shown for us that we can change the group from the inside and ultimately change the outcomes.
One very quick response to that. I couldn't agree more. That's an issue of decades, and we all know that. And you used the term earlier, the naming and shaming. That's the part that I feel has to be addressed and isn't, because until you see a former president who is openly seen, and you can pick any country, I'm not thinking of any one in particular, who is openly shunned by the social microcosm in which he or she may live for having been corrupt, I fear that all the good bottom-up work is never going to amount to much, because as we know, the United States has been involved in supporting anti-corruption efforts all over the world for decades and decades and decades, and it doesn't seem to be enough without going after that very senior level of corrupt official and making it, as you say, through the stories, making it the bad narrative, making it something no child would ever want. And I'm thinking of failures, open failures of things like the Merida Initiative in Mexico, or even Plan Colombia, where you can point to individual successes, but you can't point to the fact that in Mexico, the police are seen as the good guys, where the ministers are seen as the good guys. And so that's why I think it's everything that all of you are doing is absolutely essential, but I don't think you're ever going to be really transformatively successful until you begin to address the way in which elites, corrupt elites, are perceived in that society. And the only way to do it is through social sanction. You can put them in jail even, and many of them don't care. They come out and they're still accepted. So anyway, thank you very much for all the work you're doing.
Thank you, John. We'll go to the webcast. I think we have a couple of questions.
Encourage the other side. And this is the feeling of disempowerment, and obviously these two things are related. But how do you convince people to serve their community when they are struggling to live and to eat? So this is I guess this would come to how do you make sure that anti-corruption delivers for the people in a very concrete way, not only name and shaming the elites, but actually benefiting poor people who are just struggling to survive?
No sé qué quiera responder primero.
Who would like to respond first? It's a pretty big question. Well, I think it might have been a question for my colleague here, but it's a good question. We can't assume that these experiences are going to solve corruption. These are all levels, and there are structures. The macro structure that requires the efforts of the big institutions, etc. And I was thinking about that during our lunch, by the way. And maybe I don't know if I should say this, but basically, we have to think about everything at the level they're at. Struggling against corruption for a very poor community is really about reestablishing their rights. So it's not really about just creating institutions, but focusing on real problems. So if I tell people I'm going to guarantee public policy for development, then obviously the best way to convince civil society that this is a path that will lead to results is showing that we can do it without stealing a single cent. In terms of accountability, for example, we have to do it horizontally because we're in a phase of accountability all over. So the main point, I think, is for everyone to understand that every cent that is stolen is one right less that can be guaranteed. The participatory budget certainly contributes to stability, especially in the city of Bogotá. If that was not being done, it would not be able to establish the open government strategy, which is the way we want to do it. Collaboration, engagement, etc. But we need to take this from the root. Let's say we can't do this if we have corruption everywhere. We can't say that there's no scandal, no corruption in our government at all. And so this certainly contributes. And we've been talking for about two hours or more about this, where corruption is really just one grain of sand that we have to knock over, but there's just so many other factors. That's my input. Thank you, Alexander. Any other panelists that would like to answer? Any other questions? Any other questions from webcast or from the public? Daniel? Hi, I am Cheri-Leigh from for the Commission Against Corruption. I'd like to ask this question to each and every one of you, but especially Alexander, in terms of citizen participation. It sounds similar to the development councils that have been developed in Guatemala. My question is, what's the profile of those people who participate in these sort of processes? Because one of the main political issues that I've faced is who has the knowledge and the will, and who knows how the political mechanisms work to be able to participate here. Now you're referring to public policy that's going to, in Bogotá, maybe impact a bridge or a project that's going to affect 20,000 people or something. Well, then maybe you won't be able to meet with all these people that are going to be affected at the same time. And so who are those people? Because that is key. And the development policy in Guatemala has become the center of corruption because it's led by the district delegates. They understand how to create an association that will comply with the requirements and then be able to get the majority vote. And so that's the question I mainly wanted to ask, and all of you in general. How do we create those spaces for participation that are designed in a specific way and aren't led by political corrupt interests? Just like the development unit, for example, where there can be 15 or 20 people from civil society who are participating, representing different organizations, who are sitting with the mayors, the people from the executive office, and then there's politicians from the districts that are able to really have control over these specific projects. And so these people from civil society then speak to an executive, and the topics really sort of turn into other topics, and then the resources perhaps aren't being used in the best way because of the spaces. Yes, well, in Colombia, and in terms of the councils, in the beginning I was explaining that these are councils for land planning. So this is usually middle class, lower class, but professional people. But the paradox is that in terms of the planning, well, the biggest critique that there is for these states is that there is no binding capacity, meaning that there is no concept for developing a plan and in terms of investment. So they decide to build a concept, and it doesn't matter if it was developed well or not, and then they make recommendations and they try to incorporate the input. But the critique mainly is that it's just a lot of consultations, but it doesn't really lead to anything. But the participatory budget is really complementing local areas. Why? Because it's smaller, and because these are resources that go to smaller entities in smaller cities. Because that was a tension there, that the planning ministry said, okay, can we have the ability to decide over the resources? And we were like, no, actually, the civil society is going to decide on this. That's participatory budgeting. For citizens to decide, and how are they going to decide? Well, through votes, in person, electronic votes, for them to vote on ideas and projects. So that was that. And then the young people, for example, with the youth councils, they asked us to assign resources as well. And so we said, no. Because why? Well, all these councils are made up of young people, a list of young people, but also the political parties. And so we said, no, we don't want it like this. And so with the authority, we need to have that authority, and then you can go and communicate this message to others in your neighborhood, etc. And so I think that systematic organization has led to this not turning into corporations. For example, in Bogotá, we have a lot of authorities on participatory budget. And so what we did to be able to give people purpose is to ask them to develop proposals and give them the power of doing that. And so that can help for you to combine these two factors. So one thing is to develop ideas. Another thing is to tell civil society, the point is not to give them the money, but ask them, what are your priorities? And we can allocate the resources towards those priorities. And then people started prioritizing, and we were able to clear up what was important to them. And then we would ask, well, what would you like to vote on out of all of these priorities? And then the main challenge in Bogotá of participatory budget and in Colombia has to do with poly membership. In addition, there's the multiple representation, meaning that several topics can be, or several areas can be covered by multiple authorities. As a Colombian, I can participate in all sort of, or engage on all sort of topics, right? And I wanted to limit this on a district level and politically, but I wasn't able to do that because there's no national law, and I didn't have the authority. But really, it's about how to restrict one person so that if you're allowed to participate if you're allowed to participate in several authorities, then make sure that you only participate in maximum 3 or 4. There are people who have made up or are part of authorities for more than 16 years. And for example, I'm old now, but I met the communal leader many, many years ago. And I was able to vote on this and say, hey, it's time for you to give space to another person. But this is a very significant debate. I think we can do it, even though it's challenging. And finally, oh no, I said that already. Thank you. All right, Mariana, anybody else? Cheri, please go ahead.
Question actually to the previous one about how we get people engaged who may not understand the process even, right? And I think there are 3 important roles that civil society needs to play to ensure that everyone's engaged or that everyone can engage even in processes that might feel sort of difficult to understand. And I think firstly, civil society needs to be translators of difficult processes or of what's going on. So for example, one thing we do is where there are corruption issues and where we want to get communities engaged in that, we create infographics that are easy to understand even in low literacy areas that unpack the challenge. So for example, $100 million was stolen somewhere. What does that mean? That translates to 5 clinics that isn't being built, for example, right? And then suddenly the process is relatable and people become engaged that way because they understand the challenge. Similarly, processes of how do you even get engaged need to be broken down and simplified for people. And so I think civil society organizations need to be translators. Secondly, we also have the power of convening if we as networks of civil society organizations build new spaces for people to come together outside of what's an official government process. But if we can say 20 organizations are moving together here and we want to solve an issue in community X, we can invite the government to join that then. And what we've seen is if we create neutral spaces, then actually the government does show up if we frame it in the spirit of co-creating solutions and not just sort of mudslinging, officials tend to turn up. And we need to ultimately be connectors of communities, to private sector, to the government, so that people can see how multiple stakeholders can work together to solve challenges. Because if challenges are solved, even if it feels really small, even if it's a small service delivery change, then ultimately they're way more energized to keep and stay engaged, and you'll get more people engaged beyond sort of the usual suspects.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank our panelists, Mariana from Monterrey. Thank you very much, Mariana Perales from Hagámoslo Bien, Cheri-Leigh Erasmus from Accountability Lab, Alexander Reina from el Instituto de Capacitación y Dirección de Bogotá. Muchas gracias. Y Gabriella Castillo, muchísimas gracias. This was very informative and I think helpful with really great ideas. Please do not forget, we'll continue tomorrow with our 2 sessions. At 9 in the morning, we'll have our first session, Can Restorative Justice Address Corruption in Guatemala? And then our 3rd session at 2 in the afternoon on the private sector case for collective action against fraud. I would like to thank everybody that connected online, and we'll see you tomorrow. Gracias.